On Sunday morning, September 15, 1963, 15 sticks of dynamite exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Children had lost their lives in the church. The FBI knew who did it and why, but FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover covered it all up and obstructed justice. This isn't an event from 60 years ago. It feels like yesterday. Your grandparents lived through this era. Today, the system continues unchanged. Black people still aren't valued equally. Justice is still long overdue. How did America kill these 4 little girls, and why did they label it terrorism 40 years later? September 15, 1963, started as a beautiful Sunday morning in Birmingham, Alabama. Inside the 16th Street Baptist Church, the most prominent black congregation in the city, children were preparing for Youth Day services. In the basement ladies' lounge, 4 girls, Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, were putting on their white choir robes, fixing their hair, and talking about the sermon they were about to hear. The topic that morning was the love that forgives. At 10:22 a.m., 15 sticks of dynamite exploded beneath the steps near the basement, directly under where the 4 girls stood. The blast was so powerful it blew out the church's stained glass windows, destroyed the back wall, and could be heard miles away. Denise McNair was 11 years old. Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley were all 14. Their bodies were found in the rubble, buried under bricks and mortar, killed instantly by the force of the explosion. 22 others were injured, some permanently. This was not a random act of violence. This was not a tragedy without a cause. This was domestic terrorism, a calculated act of mass murder designed to terrorize Birmingham's black community and punish them for daring to demand their constitutional rights. The FBI knew within days who had planted the bomb: 4 Ku Klux Klan members, Robert Chambliss, Bobby Frank Cherry, Thomas Blanton, and Herman Cash. But the first arrest didn't happen until 1977, 14 years later. The last conviction came in 2002, 39 years after 4 little girls were murdered while preparing to worship God. Here is the story of how America allowed its children to be bombed in a church, how it protected the killers for decades, and how justice delayed became justice denied for families who deserved so much better. 1. The girls who died preparing to worship. Denise McNair was 11 years old, the youngest of the 4, the only child of Chris and Maxine McNair. She was a bright, joyful girl who loved to read and was preparing to sing in the children's choir that Sunday. Her father was a photographer who later would document the civil rights movement, capturing images of pain and protest. But on September 15, 1963, he stood outside the bombed church searching for his daughter, praying she had somehow survived. She hadn't. Denise's body was found in the rubble, killed instantly. At her funeral, her small white casket was surrounded by flowers and grief, so profound that the entire nation, even those who had remained silent in the face of Birmingham's violence, could not ignore it. Addie Mae Collins was 14 years old, one of 8 children in her family. Her younger sister Sarah was also in the church that Sunday, and survived with injuries that left her partially blind. Addie Mae had gotten up early that morning to press her dress, excited about Youth Day and her role in the service. Her family described her as kind, studious, and deeply religious. She died doing exactly what she loved, preparing to serve in her church, in the house of God that was supposed to be a sanctuary. Carol Robertson was 14, an honors student, Girl Scout, and member of the church science club. She played clarinet in the school band and was known for her academic excellence and leadership. Her parents were teachers who had instilled in their daughter a belief that education and dignity would overcome racism. Carol represented the best of what Birmingham's black community was building: intelligent, accomplished, hopeful. She was murdered for being black in a church in the wrong city at the wrong time. Cynthia Wesley was 14, recently adopted, a star student who planned to become a teacher. She was described by everyone who knew her as kind, serious about her studies, and devoted to her church. Her parents had given her everything they could: love, stability, education, faith. None of it protected her from 15 sticks of dynamite planted by men who hated her for the color of her skin. These 4 girls were not symbols or statistics. They were children with favorite foods, with homework assignments, with dreams about their futures. They were putting on choir robes and fixing their hair. They were in the safest place their community had, a church on a Sunday morning, preparing to worship, and someone murdered them anyway. 2. Birmingham, a city of terror, To understand why the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed, you need to understand Birmingham in 1963. The city had earned the nickname Bombingham because between 1947 and 1963 there were over 50 bombings targeting black homes, churches and businesses. Not one person had been convicted for any of these attacks. Black residents lived in constant fear, knowing that buying a home in the wrong neighborhood, achieving too much success, or speaking out against segregation could result in your house being bombed in the night. The Ku Klux Klan operated openly, with police officers and city officials as members. Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connor was an avowed segregationist who had ordered fire hoses and police dogs turned on peaceful protesters, including children, during the Birmingham campaign earlier that year. The images of children being knocked down by water pressure strong enough to strip bark from trees, of teenagers being attacked by German shepherds, had shocked the nation and the world. But in Birmingham, this was normal. This was how the city maintained white supremacy. The 16th Street Baptist Church wasn't chosen randomly. It was the largest and most prominent black church in Birmingham, a gathering place for civil rights meetings, a staging area for protests, and a symbol of black faith and resistance. Bombing it sent a message: nowhere is safe, not even God's house. It was meant to break the spirit of Birmingham's black community, to terrorize them into abandoning the civil rights movement, to prove that white supremacy would murder children to maintain power. The bombing came just weeks after the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. It came during a period when Birmingham's white establishment was being forced to desegregate public facilities. The bombing was retaliation, a violent reassertion of white power, and a warning about what would happen to black people who demanded equality. 3. The FBI knew immediately and did nothing. Within days of the bombing, the FBI had identified the perpetrators. Informants within the Ku Klux Klan provided names and details. Witnesses had seen the suspects near the church. Evidence pointed clearly to Robert Edward Chambliss, Bobby Frank Cherry, Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr., and Herman Frank Cash, all Klan members known for violence and bombing expertise. FBI agents interviewed the suspects, gathered evidence, and built a case. Then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover blocked prosecution. The reasons were never fully explained, but the pattern was clear. Hoover's FBI was far more concerned with monitoring and disrupting civil rights organizations than with prosecuting white supremacist terrorists. Hoover had FBI agents surveilling Martin Luther King Jr., attempting to blackmail him and working to discredit the civil rights movement while doing virtually nothing to stop Klan violence that was killing black Americans. The Birmingham FBI office recommended prosecution in 1965. Hoover refused. Files were sealed. Evidence was buried. The case went cold, not because it couldn't be solved, but because the most powerful law enforcement agency in America chose not to solve it. Robert Chambliss walked free. Bobby Frank Cherry walked free. Thomas Blanton walked free. Herman Cash walked free. They lived normal lives, raised families, attended community events, and never faced consequences for murdering 4 children. They bragged about the bombing to friends and family. They were known in Birmingham as the men who bombed the church. Everyone knew, and no one could touch them because the FBI had decided their prosecution wasn't a priority. For 14 years, the families of Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley watched their daughters' killers walk the streets of Birmingham as free men. They saw them at grocery stores, driving past their homes, living lives that their daughters would never have. And there was nothing they could do because the government had abandoned them. 4. Robert Chambliss, convicted 14 years later for one girl. Finally, in 1977, Alabama Attorney General Bill Baxley reopened the case. Baxley had been haunted by the bombing since childhood and made prosecuting the bombers a priority when he took office. He faced massive resistance, missing evidence, uncooperative witnesses, sealed FBI files, and a political establishment that wanted the case to remain closed. But Baxley persisted, and on November 18, 1977, Robert Edward Chambliss was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Denise McNair. Just one of the 4 girls, just one murder charge. After 14 years, Chambliss was 73 years old when convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison in 1985, still maintaining his innocence, still refusing to name his accomplices. The conviction was celebrated as justice finally served, but it was incomplete justice, delayed justice, inadequate justice. 3 other bombers remained free. 3 other families still had no legal recognition of their daughters' murders. And 14 years had passed, years when evidence had been lost, witnesses had died, and memories had faded. The Chambliss conviction proved the bombing could have been prosecuted decades earlier if authorities had wanted to. The FBI had the evidence in 1963. They chose not to use it. The delay was a choice, and that choice allowed 3 other murderers to live free for decades more. 5. Thomas Blanton, convicted 38 years later. In the late 1990s, the FBI finally turned over long-sealed files to state prosecutors. Recordings emerged. FBI surveillance tapes from the 1960s, where Thomas Blanton discussed the bombing, where he and others made incriminating statements that had been buried for over 30 years. In 2001, 38 years after the bombing, Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. was convicted of 4 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He was 62 years old. He had lived his entire adult life as a free man, despite murdering 4 children. He had worked, married, raised children, attended family gatherings, celebrated holidays, lived a normal life while Denise, Addie Mae, Carol and Cynthia remained forever young in their graves. Blanton showed no remorse at trial. He maintained his innocence despite recorded evidence of his own voice discussing the bombing. He died in prison in 2020, at age 82, having served only 19 years for murdering 4 children. The 38-year delay meant that much of his life was lived in freedom. It meant that the families waited nearly 4 decades for acknowledgement that their daughter's murders mattered. It meant that justice, such as it was, came so late that it could never truly be just. 6. Bobby Frank Cherry, convicted 39 years later. Bobby Frank Cherry was the last bomber to face trial. He had bragged about the bombing for years, telling family members and acquaintances about his role, secure in the knowledge that authorities wouldn't prosecute him. His ex-wife and granddaughter both testified that he had admitted his involvement, that he had described planting the bomb, that he had laughed about killing children. In 2002, 39 years after the bombing, Bobby Frank Cherry was convicted of 4 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He was 71 years old. He had lived free for 39 years. He died in prison in 2004, just 2 years after conviction, having served almost no time for his crimes. Cherry's trial revealed the horror of how many people had known about his involvement and had said nothing. Family members testified against him, but only after decades of silence. The culture of fear, the protection that white supremacy offered to its terrorists, and the failure of authorities to prosecute had created an environment where a child murderer could brag about his crimes for 40 years. The conviction brought no real justice. Cherry was an old man who spent 2 years in prison before dying of natural causes. His victims never grew old, their families never stopped grieving, and 39 years was far too long to wait for the legal system to acknowledge what everyone in Birmingham had always known. 7. Herman Cash died unpunished in 1994. Herman Frank Cash was identified by the FBI in 1965 as one of the 4 bombers. Witnesses placed him at the church. Evidence connected him to the conspiracy, but he was never charged. He lived his entire life as a free man and died of natural causes in 1994 at age 70, having never faced trial for murdering 4 children. Cash's freedom represents the ultimate failure of justice in this case. While Chambliss, Blanton and Cherry eventually faced consequences, inadequate and delayed as they were, Cash experienced none. He lived, worked, raised a family, and died peacefully in his bed. His involvement in one of the most notorious acts of domestic terrorism in American history, never legally addressed. The families of the 4 girls knew that Herman Cash helped murder their daughters. The FBI knew. Birmingham knew. But the legal system never held him accountable. When he died in 1994, any possibility of prosecuting him died with him. His death meant that 1/4 of the men responsible would never answer for their crimes, that justice would remain forever incomplete, that the families would never have full legal acknowledgement of what had been done to their daughters. Herman Cash is buried in Alabama, having lived a full life that Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley never got to experience. His grave bears no marker of shame, no acknowledgement of the children he murdered, nothing to indicate that he was anything other than an ordinary man who lived an ordinary life. Chris McNair, Denise's father, lived with the knowledge of who killed his daughter for 14 years before the first conviction. He attended every hearing, every trial, seeking justice that came in painful increments across 4 decades. He died in 2019, having spent 56 years as the father of a murdered child, having fought longer for justice than his daughter lived. Maxine McNair, Denise's mother, waited 59 years for the last conviction, endured decades of seeing her daughter's killers walk free, and carried grief that never diminished. She lived long enough to see some justice, but justice that came so late, it could never truly heal. The parents of Addie Mae, Carol and Cynthia, experienced the same agonizing weight. They buried their daughters, then watched the men who murdered them live free for decades. Some parents died before seeing any convictions. Others lived to see partial justice, but never full accountability. Sarah Collins, Addie Mae's younger sister, who survived the bombing but lost an eye and carries shrapnel in her body to this day, waited 38 years to see her sister's killers convicted. She was 12 years old when the bomb exploded, 49 when Blanton was convicted, and 50 when Cherry was convicted. She lived most of her life with physical and psychological scars from the bombing, knowing who was responsible but watching them live free. These families were victimized twice, first by the bombing that murdered their daughters, then by a legal system that abandoned them for decades, that chose not to prosecute cases that could have been won, that valued white supremacist violence less than black lives and black grief. 9. Why it took 40 years. Institutional racism and protective. The 40-year delay in justice wasn't accidental. It was the result of systemic choices at every level of government and society that protected white supremacist terrorists and devalued black lives. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI chose not to prosecute despite having evidence and suspects identified within days. Local prosecutors chose not to pursue cases even when FBI files became available. Judges and juries in the 1960s South would likely have acquitted white bombers regardless of evidence, creating a climate where prosecution seemed futile. Witnesses feared retaliation, knowing that the Klan operated openly and that law enforcement wouldn't protect them. Political leaders prioritized moving on and healing over accountability, arguing that prosecuting old cases would reopen wounds, as if the wounds had ever closed for the families. The FBI's COINTELPRO program spent vastly more resources monitoring Martin Luther King Jr. and infiltrating civil rights organizations than investigating Klan bombings. The message was clear. The federal government viewed black people demanding equality as a greater threat than white supremacists murdering black children. Evidence was sealed, files were classified, and information that could have led to convictions was deliberately withheld from state prosecutors for decades. When Bill Baxley finally secured Chambliss's conviction in 1977, he did so despite FBI obstruction, not with FBI assistance. The culture of Birmingham itself protected the bombers. Many white residents knew or suspected who was responsible, but remained silent, valuing racial solidarity over justice. The Klan had community support, church support, and political protection that made members feel invincible. This wasn't justice delayed by incompetence. This was justice deliberately denied by a system designed to protect white supremacy and punish black resistance. 10. The national impact and what changed. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing shocked even those who had remained neutral or silent about civil rights. The murder of 4 girls in a church on Sunday morning was so heinous, so clearly evil, that it penetrated defenses and changed minds. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the eulogy at a joint funeral for 3 of the girls, calling them martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity. He said their deaths would transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. The bombing contributed directly to passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Politicians who had opposed civil rights legislation found it harder to justify their positions after children were murdered in church. The bombing connected directly to Bloody Sunday in Selma, 18 months later, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The murders galvanized activists and made it impossible to ignore the violent resistance black Americans faced. The bombing became a symbol of the civil rights movement's cost, evidence of the lengths white supremacists would go to maintain power, and proof that black Americans demanding equality faced literal terrorism. But change came slowly and incompletely. The bombers lived free for decades, similar violence continued, and the systems that protected the killers adapted rather than disappeared. The bombing's ultimate legacy is complex. It helped advance civil rights legislation while demonstrating how long justice could be denied, how completely the legal system could abandon black victims, and how white supremacist terrorism could operate with near impunity for generations. Beyond criminal prosecution, the families fought for decades for financial compensation and official recognition of what happened. It wasn't until 2013, 50 years after the bombing, that Alabama agreed to pay $1.5 million to Sarah Collins Rudolph, Addie Mae's sister, who survived with permanent injuries. She had waited half a century for the state to acknowledge its responsibility for her medical costs and suffering. The families also fought for memorials, historical markers, and educational programs to ensure the bombing would be remembered. The church itself became a national historic landmark, and a museum was established to tell the story. But these recognitions came slowly, grudgingly, often only after persistent advocacy. In 2013, President Barack Obama awarded the Congressional Gold Medal posthumously to the 4 girls, 50 years after their deaths, an honor that came far too late for their parents to witness. The families appreciated the recognition, but noted bitterly that gold medals couldn't bring back daughters or replace the decades of justice denied. The fight for recognition revealed how reluctant institutions were to fully acknowledge what happened, to admit that American children were murdered by domestic terrorists, that the government failed to protect them, and that justice was deliberately denied for decades. Every memorial, every compensation payment, every official acknowledgement had to be fought for, as if the bombing itself wasn't enough, as if the families needed to prove over and over that their daughters' lives mattered. 12 point. Sarah Collins Rudolph, the forgotten 5th girl. Sarah Collins was 12 years old, standing next to her sister Addie Mae in the church bathroom when the bomb exploded. The blast destroyed her right eye and embedded glass and debris throughout her face and body. She survived but carries physical scars and shrapnel in her body to this day. For 50 years, Sarah was called the 5th little girl, the one who survived but was often forgotten in the narrative about the 4 who died. She underwent multiple surgeries, lived with chronic pain, struggled financially, and received virtually no support from the state that had failed to protect her. In 2013, 50 years after the bombing, Alabama finally agreed to pay her compensation. $1.5 million sounds like a lot, until you realize it covered 50 years of medical expenses, lost wages from disability, and the immeasurable trauma of watching your sister die beside you and carrying the physical and psychological scars forever. Sarah Collins Rudolph is 73 years old now. She still lives in Birmingham, not far from the church where her childhood ended violently on a Sunday morning in 1963. She still has shrapnel in her body that doctors couldn't remove. She still remembers her sister Addie Mae putting on her choir robe minutes before the bomb exploded. Sarah represents the survivors, those who lived through civil rights-era violence and carry its marks forever, those who are often forgotten in favor of focusing on the dead, those who had to continue living with trauma while watching their attackers live free. Her story reminds us that the bombing didn't just kill 4 girls, it destroyed families, traumatized a community, and created lifelong suffering that no compensation or conviction could fully address. 4 little girls went to church on a Sunday morning in September 1963. They put on white choir robes, fixed their hair, and prepared to sing about love and forgiveness. Someone murdered them with 15 sticks of dynamite. The FBI knew who did it within days. The first prosecution came 14 years later. The last came 39 years later. One bomber died without ever facing trial. This is American justice for black victims, delayed, incomplete, inadequate, and denied for as long as possible. Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley deserved better. Their families deserved better. And America still hasn't fully reckoned with what it means that children could be bombed in church and their killers protected for decades by the very systems that were supposed to deliver justice. Say their names, remember their stories, and understand that this wasn't ancient history. This happened in the lifetime of people still living, and the systems that failed them are still operating today. Which part of this story affected you most? Share this video so their names are never forgotten, and subscribe to Golden Yesterdays to preserve the history they tried to bury.